There we go. Good morning, good afternoon. If you are somewhere in the East, welcome to this special webinar we're having in the hydrogen workstream at WBCSD. This one is a little bit different than the sort of the usual webinars that we do, in that it's not meant for hydrogen experts. So if you're hearing a lot about hydrogen and want to know why, this is probably a good one for you. So welcome. First of all, a quick reminder to avoid any competitively sensitive topic, of course, that goes without saying. I don't think we will touch anything close to that today, but if we are and none of us is stopping the conversation, please do so and intervene. So as I've said, you're probably here because you're hearing a lot about hydrogen and you'd like to know why. What makes it so sexy at the moment, and why are people so excited about hydrogen? And there's essentially two reasons why we're talking about it a lot nowadays. The first one is that it is seen as a key way to help us decarbonize towards a net zero society. And the other reason is also because there's been a lot of cost reductions in the past few years in enabling technologies such as electrolysis, but also renewable electricity. And in fact, that this graph here that I'm showing, I had two sides and I had to crop the right-hand side because it was so out of date already from 2 years ago. And I had to update it here to tell you that today, or at least as of the end of last year, there was more than 30 countries that had a hydrogen strategy and more than 500 large-scale projects that have been announced. So we're going to go into the details of that, and the people who are going to help you understand this topic today are Magnus, Molly, and Loic. Magnus, I will let you introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. My name is Magnus Killingland. I'm the segment lead for hydrogen and CCS together with e-fuels in DNV in Northern Europe.
Thanks, Magnus. Molly, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Caroline. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molly Iliff. I work for ERM, which is the world's largest sustainability consultancy. And there I lead ERM's hydrogen economics and financial modelling function. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Molly. Loic?
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm also principal consultant at ERM, and I'm focusing my work on hydrogen.
Thanks, Loic, for joining us. And myself, I lead the hydrogen workstream at WBCSD as a secondee from Shell and been doing so for the past 18 months. So we're all very excited to take you through this topic today, and we hope that you find that useful. So what we're going to cover, we will first have a safety moment, of course, then we'll talk about hydrogen today. Magnus will tell you all about where hydrogen could be in 2050, and Molly will try and explain what needs to happen between now and then to make it a reality. And then we will allow ample time for questions, so you will have time to ask anything you'd like to know. So if we look at hydrogen today, so first of all, let's be clear, there will be no hydrogen economy and no hydrogen industry unless it is a safe one. When you talk about hydrogen to members of the public, usually the thing that comes to mind for them is the Hindenburg disaster in 1937, the big airship or Zeppelin that blew up in New Jersey. So that's still on people's mind, and for good reason. And more recently, there have been incidents at filling stations in South Korea and in Norway. And in Norway, especially, that's really affected the public confidence in this technology, and rightly so. So it is key that we get this right and that we get this safe. Otherwise, this could, put us back years or decades behind on our decarbonization goals. So to show you what we mean, our colleagues at DNV have been very kind to provide videos of testing that they've done in Spadeadam in the UK. I am going to warn you, if this is the morning and you're not fully awake, you will be in a second. If you're wearing a headset, this will pop. So let's go. There we go. So this was an explosion with a 20% mix of hydrogen. And oops, sorry, it started again. And so what you need to know is that at high concentrations like this, it has a much higher burning velocity than hydrocarbons, which means that essentially the damage from the explosion can be bigger. However, if the concentration is lower, it is similar to hydrocarbons. So let's first start with what is hydrogen. And you've got for the people who like a bit of physics and chemistry, you've got a table here. But let's compare it with a molecule that most of us are fairly familiar with, which is methane, which is the gas that you may be cooking with. So methane, 1 atom of carbon, 4 atoms of hydrogen, and hydrogen is basically dihydrogen, actually, because it's 2 atoms of hydrogen tightly bound together. So if we compare that with natural gas, what you need to know is that it's essentially a lot lighter. It's a smaller molecule, which means that it's going to leak a lot more easily. So when we talk about repurposing infrastructure, for example, it will be very important to check that basically it's possible. At the flanges in compressors and so on, we could have leaks that we're not seeing with methane. It also has a much wider ignition range than methane, and it doesn't take a lot to ignite it. So that makes it a lot more dangerous in that way. And at the same time, to help balance that, thankfully, it also disperses a lot quicker, being so light. If you get the mass, it packs a lot more energy than methane. The problem is that that mass takes a very large volume to achieve. So either you will have to compress it to very high pressures, or to liquefy close to the absolute zero, which means that that also takes a lot of energy and is not something that is that easy to do. This also means that if you blend 9% of hydrogen in say, a gas pipe, you will only get a 3% gain in emissions reduction, because that 9% of hydrogen only has the energy of 3% of methane, essentially. So all of this means that transportation in particular is challenging, and that it can be fairly unforgiving if you get the right circumstances for either a jet fire or an explosion even. By the way, one thing I didn't say, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box so that Loic can start to filter them and to organize them, and we'll put them to the presenters at the end. Okay, so having said that, we are doing and making quite a lot of hydrogen today, and we seem to be doing that safely, which is good news. So we do have the know-how. If we look at the production today, it mainly comes from a process called steam methane reforming in refineries, essentially, or chemical plants. That's what we call gray hydrogen, and it's nearly 75% of all the hydrogen today. The other source is from coal gasification, which we call black hydrogen. And we make about 80 million tons per annum of it on purpose, but it's also a byproduct of a number of chemical reactions, which means that there is also quite a large quantity that comes nearly for free as a byproduct of something else. Now, these numbers, you may have seen something different. It really depends on which report you base yourself on. There, in which year things are moving a little bit, of course. Now, where it is used, it's used in 3 main ways. The first one, and really the main use today, is as feedstock for the chemical, refining, and fertilizer industry. So, for example, to make methanol, but also to make better fuels, and in the fertilizer industry to make ammonia. So that's how we use it today. You can also get a lot of energy from it, as we've seen, if you burn it, but that is quite a minor usage today. And then another way to use it is also as energy, but this time by converting it to back to electricity in a fuel cell. And that is, so some of those are some of the applications that are likely to develop in the future, and Magnus will tell you more about that. Now, you may have heard about blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, and be wondering what all those colors mean. So I'm going to talk you through that. And I also want to mention the carbon intensity of those various kinds of hydrogen. So I'm saying various kinds. Hydrogen is hydrogen. So you get the same product, maybe in slightly different purity levels. It's essentially the same molecule that you get in different ways. And in terms of carbon intensity, we're looking at full life cycle. So that includes emissions from infrastructure, construction, decommissioning, etc., in addition to operation, of course. And we're going to talk here in kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So we have, first of all, green hydrogen from electrolysis with renewable electricity. So whether that's from wind, from solar, or even from hydro power. And the carbon intensity is very low, from 0.3 to about 1. In some cases, that can go a bit higher in the case of solar, because of the embedded emissions in solar panel, which is a very energy intensive process and tends to be made in China on a coal-based grid. So that there's a lot of emissions at the moment. That is expected to reduce though. Now, green hydrogen today is marginal. However, it is expected to be the main form of hydrogen in 2050. Now, then we have blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen is basically from methane, something that, as we've seen, the industry is quite used to be doing already, but this time with carbon capture and storage. The question, of course, is how much carbon are you capturing, and therefore how good is your blue hydrogen? This is why the intensity can vary quite a bit, from 1.2 if you're using technology like ATR, which enables you to capture more of the carbon, and an SMR with 60% CCS, which means that it's only pre-combustion CCS, would take you to 4.5 to about 6 potentially kilo of CO2 per kilo of hydrogen. Then you've got a more marginal technology today, but promising for the future, which is from methane pyrolysis, with intensity depending a lot if you can take credit for the carbon displaced or not, and also how you're doing the process. Then we have pink hydrogen. Well, pink is the main, you know, how it's mainly called, but sometimes you might have seen that called yellow or purple. It is basically when you have your electrolyzer hooked up to nuclear power. Electrolysis, by the way, for anyone who hasn't got the sort of engineering or scientific background, you take a bucket of water, you stick two electrodes in it, you apply some currents, and basically you're breaking up the molecule of water into hydrogen and oxygen, which has both pros and cons. On the pros, the oxygen is a nice byproduct that you can also find value for example, as oxygen for hospitals. But also it makes the process potentially more flammable and dangerous. So that was my explanation of electrolysis in 30 seconds. So the pink hydrogen, as we've said, from nuclear, and it's got quite a good carbon intensity, or low carbon intensity at 0.6. Then you've got yellow hydrogen, something, this one sometimes is called something different, but that's the most commonly used color. It's when you hook up your electrolyzer to the grid. And this depends very much then your carbon intensity on the carbon intensity of that, that grid. So the current global mix would get you a carbon intensity of 25, which is terrible. If it was a coal-based grid, then that's even worse. It's expected that in 2030, that might get you to 11, which is still not good. If you're in a country like France with mainly nuclear and a few other things, it would get you below 3, which is much better. But obviously here, it all depends on the carbon intensity of your grid. Gray hydrogen, as we've seen in the slide before, is from steam methane reforming. The intensity is about 11. Then you've got brown and black hydrogen from lignite or coal gasification, and the intensity is really high at 22. There are other forms of hydrogen, which we're not talking so much about because these are marginal technologies today and still to be developed. But believe it or not, there's quite a lot of hydrogen at the bottom of oceans. So we call that white hydrogen. Of course, it's a bit of a pain to get it. We haven't quite figured that out, but potentially an area to look into. And then there's also things for which we don't really have a color at the moment. So you could actually do SMR or ATR with biomass gas instead of fossil fuel gas. That would potentially take your carbon intensity in the negative figures. And also other processes like partial oxidation and so on. The intensity really depends on what that process is. So I hope, in a nutshell, that I've demystified all the colors of hydrogen and that it's been helpful. I've explained where hydrogen is at today, and now I'm going to hand over to Magnus, who's going to tell us all about where hydrogen could be and where it could be used for in 2050.
Yes, thank you, Caroline, for the introduction. As you mentioned, the hydrogen production and consumption today is about 115 million tons per year globally. But the question is, going forward, is how much can it scale and how fast can it scale? What role can hydrogen take for decarbonization in various sectors? And there are several estimates on future volumes, both forecasts with business as usual and scenarios for reaching a net zero future. You have, for instance, IEA, you have the Hydrogen Council, Bloomberg, but also countries and regions like EU with different strategies and estimates. And we also do it in DNV. In the next slide, you will see that there are kind of two main dimensions to scaling up. And that is decarbonization of the existing use, the gray hydrogen, which is used in refineries and industry. But also it's all about scaling up the new use and offtake. So in industry and refining, it's mainly about decarbonization, replacing the gray hydrogen with blue and green. This industry sector is characterized with large volumes. They usually have captive customers. So it's likely that blue hydrogen will play a role with low purity and lower cost. But some subsectors like steel will create new demand. Hydrogen carriers such as ammonia is both important for decarbonization of existing ammonia and fertilizer value chains as a global commodity, but also new use for ammonia and hydrogen carriers such as fuels for the maritime sector. For instance, for deep sea shipping across large seas and between continents. New hydrogen offtake is most needed where electrification and biofuels is not possible, and that is mainly for long distance and heavy duty transport. So what is the quickest way to decarbonize these sectors? Some claim it is to reuse existing infrastructure and make synthetic hydrocarbons, so-called drop-in fuels, with the same physical properties as existing aviation fuel or gasolines. A lot of hydrogen is then needed, especially if e-fuels is to be produced with making synthesis gases and combining hydrogen with CO2. That has its own challenges, but also many opportunities on reusing existing infrastructure and reducing costs. But if you're going to make e-fuels, then you also need CO2, and preferably biogenic or atmospheric, to keep the carbon footprint low. Hydrogen can also be used directly in transport, in fuel cells or combustion in turbines or engines. However, due to the lower energy density and the rapid development of batteries, it's most likely that hydrogen will play a role for instance, medium-haul aviation and other short distance or near coast shipping and also possible some trains. So on the next slide, we can dive more into what sectors are most relevant for hydrogen and look at competing technologies. So here we can have a look at a so-called hydrogen ladder, which defines which sectors are most relevant at A at the top, and less competitive or uncompetitive at the bottom. So as I mentioned in previous slides, some of these sectors that use hydrogen today really cannot do electrification and have to continue using hydrogen, but then cleaner hydrogen. So for each sector, there will be some new hydrogen use, but the green boxes shows where, for instance, biogas and biofuels may provide most of the energy input, and the yellow shows where electrification may play a larger part and compete with the uptake of hydrogen. When it comes to biomass and biogas, personally, I believe that we do not have enough sustainable biomass or biogas. So some of these green boxes may be red, like for instance, shipping, long-haul aviation, and some of these hard-to-abate sectors. So how fast hydrogen scales depends on these competing technologies based again on regulatory frameworks and in industry initiatives. So this you can have a look at later and we can also of course discuss this, which sectors we think will have a larger or less uptake of hydrogen. So hydrogen may play a large or a smaller role for decarbonization in the world. Here we see one scenario on how much hydrogen may play a part. This is from the Hydrogen Council scenario. And one possibility is then that clean hydrogen can be a solution for 1/5 of our remaining carbon budget. This depends, of course, on how fast it scales up. So we have about 400 gigatons of emissions left on our carbon budget if you want to reach, not go above 1.5 degrees. That is happening within 10 to 15 years. And if you manage to scale hydrogen fast and safe, hydrogen can be one important tool for decarbonization, together with a lot of other measures. On the next slide, we see an overview of a lot of projects. It's amazing how many projects is being developed, both small and large. Some are focusing on replacing the captive hydrogen production offtake, but others focus on producing hydrogen where you have very low cost renewables and look for value chains where you can trade hydrogen globally within regions, but also across continents. An electrolyzer can be built within a few months, so the production scale up is easier than new offtake. For instance, a green steel mill or fertilizer plant may take years to construct. So it really depends on the demand side, how fast that scales. So most of these projects focus on low carbon hydrogen, on renewable hydrogen, below, for instance, 3 to 4 kilos or even lower, to meet those criteria. We see now that both in China, Europe, US, and other countries have limits for CO2 intensity and what's allowed to call low carbon or renewable hydrogen. And then my final slide shows that a lot of investments is needed. There is a lot of announced direct investments, but much more is needed if you're going to reach these ambitious emissions targets. Now I'll give the word to Molly Ilf that will look more into what is needed. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Magnus. It's great. Hi, everyone. Okay, so Magnus has explained to you the kind of exciting future, how we might see hydrogen develop. What I'm going to talk to you about is what are some of the barriers that we need to overcome in order to get there, and what are some of the enablers to overcome these. And I'll also explain to you a potential pathway that we might see in terms of the development of the hydrogen economy over time as we gradually overcome these barriers, and a couple of sectors that might be quite critical to achieving those goals. And I'm going to do it all in 15 minutes, so we'll see how it goes. It's a lot to cram in. The first couple of slides give an overview of some of the key barriers and enablers for the large-scale uptake of low-carbon hydrogen, by which we're including basically anything that isn't grey, so sort of green, blue, pink hydrogen, sort of different colours that Caroline explained earlier. So firstly, the first critical barrier, which receives a lot of attention, and rightly so, is around production costs associated with low carbon hydrogen. So it's no secret that it's much more expensive to produce low carbon hydrogen than it is to use conventional fuels that exist at the moment. And although we can see that significant cost reductions are likely to develop over time, there's a lot of uncertainty around when those cost reductions will be realized. So when we'll achieve different types of hydrogen, we'll achieve cost parity with other conventional fuels that we're using at the moment. So I'll go into this barrier in a little bit more detail once I've given you an overview of all of the barriers, because it's quite an important one. So it's good to fully understand that. The second barrier is around infrastructure to enable the bulk rollout of hydrogen production and transport from production centres to key demand centres. And that includes the need to repurpose existing pipeline infrastructure or build existing pipelines. Also, how can we store hydrogen in bulk? And different regions will have different options which are feasible in order to do that, depending on what existing infrastructure they have, what geological features, if they have depleted oil and gas reserves, things like that. So there's a lot of work going on in this area at the moment, and particularly in countries which already have a lot of sunk investment costs in existing gas pipeline networks, like the UK and the Netherlands and Portugal. The next barrier is around regulation and policy, and this is also a really critical enabler of the hydrogen economy, particularly in the early stages. For early stage projects, they're having to work collaboratively with regulatory authorities on the health and safety side, that's already been discussed, but across the whole value chain of hydrogen production, transport and use, to ensure that it's safe and to develop different technical standards. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around the regulatory space that requires a lot of collaboration between different actors to lay the groundwork for these early stage projects and then enable us to progress from there to much larger scale projects. And the other key sort of barrier and enabler is around hydrogen policy. So particularly for early stage projects, which won't be commercially viable on their own merit, they need grant funding support, revenue funding support from governments in order to make them investable. And there's also a role for policy in terms of market creation. So for early mover markets, there's a carrot approach or a stick approach that policymakers can adopt in order to create markets for the hydrogen that is produced. So that's an important enabler that will open up bulk hydrogen generation. And then the final sort of barrier on this slide is demand and supply matching. And there's this is a significant issue for a nascent industry like hydrogen, because there's a need to develop demand and supply concurrently, which is actually very difficult. And it means that early stage hydrogen projects are generally being developed with a captive off-taker that has committed long-term to take the hydrogen from that project under a long-term off-take agreement. And that's the only way in which these projects can be investable and move forward. Can we go to the next slide, please? So a few more barriers and enablers, and I promise in a minute I'll get on to how we can overcome these, rather than just explaining, what the barriers are. So the first one is around bulk transport. So one of the interesting features of hydrogen, and one of the reasons why it could be such a game changer in terms of the energy industry as we look forward, is that the areas of bulk hydrogen production will be sort of very different from, or are likely to be very different from the fossil fuel producing regions that we see at the moment in the longer term. But also the areas of demand, bulk demand for hydrogen are likely to be very different from the areas of bulk supply. So we're going to see a need for bulk transport, marine transport of hydrogen from, for example, Australia and the Middle East, where there's a very good renewables resource, so you could produce hydrogen quite cheaply. Also, there's potential for blue hydrogen as well, potentially other colors of hydrogen. But hydrogen itself is very difficult to store and transport. So it's likely that it will need to be converted to a hydrogen carrier like ammonia or methanol or liquid organic hydrogen carriers in order to transport it in bulk via a ship. So that brings a whole load of different challenges and opportunities, and the different carriers have different pros and cons and are at different levels in terms of technical readiness. So it's not clear at the moment which hydrogen carrier might become dominant over time. There's a lot of interest in ammonia because most elements of the value chain are at quite a high level of technical readiness, but it's highly toxic in a marine environment, and there are advantages to liquid organic hydrogen carriers because they're sort of oil-like substances that can be stored at ambient pressure and temperature in repurposed oil infrastructure. So that's really interesting, and that's a key area that's likely to develop over time and become a real enabler of the development of hydrogen as a globally traded commodity. The next barrier is around energy losses. So this is something that's a key area of focus for OEMs, so original equipment manufacturers at the moment. And that relates to losses across the whole of the value chain. So hydrogen production, also potentially conversion to hydrogen carriers. So you might see, a 10 to 25% energy loss through that process. So this is a key area of focus at the moment. Life cycle sustainability is something that's likely to become increasingly important, particularly in markets like Europe, but also globally. The certification system for hydrogen, which will be critical in order to achieve success and to facilitate a global market, is likely to involve life cycle emissions associated with that hydrogen, not just the hydrogen production, but every element across the value chain. And it's also likely that wider sustainability issues, so things like recyclability of components that we're seeing becoming increasingly important for the wind industry, for example, that's also likely to be reflected in the hydrogen industry. So something to keep an eye on. And that links with this last sort of value and enabler, which is value recognition. So in order for low carbon hydrogen to be able to attract the premium that it will need in the market compared to grey hydrogen, because it has higher costs, there'll need to be an effective system for it to be certified and for it to be able to capture that from off-takers. And that will enable it to us to move forward with this market globally at scale. So that's a quick overview of some of the barriers and enablers. So a quick deep dive over the next couple of slides into costs, because this is a sort of a critical issue and something that a lot of people are very mindful of at the moment. So I've sort of broadly characterized some of the drivers around bringing down hydrogen costs over time in three key areas here. So the first one is really around technology, the second one is around production, and the third one is around financing availability. So first of all, around technology, there needs to be, we've made a lot of progress over the last few years, but looking forward, we expect a lot more progress to be made across the whole hydrogen value chain in order to develop technology, improve performance, and reduce costs. We're seeing key equipment manufacturers move to bulk production at scale in serialized manufacture, and that's having a massive impact on costs of things like electrolyzers. But there's a lot more that still needs to be done. There's also potential to optimize business models, and this is reflected in the focus on hydrogen valleys and islands, so that projects can share infrastructure between each other and reduce costs, and also capture synergies, for example, by using waste heat or byproducts of industrial processes as part of the production of hydrogen carriers or the conversion back to hydrogen. So that's a couple of important areas that can be used to bring down costs going forward. The second sort of area is around the hydrogen production itself. We're likely to see a vast acceleration in scale over this decade, and then as we move into the next decade and we see gigawatt scale projects emerging. At the moment, projects are very small scale, demonstrator stage, but we know that that's going to rapidly accelerate over time. For green hydrogen, levelized cost of electricity is continuing to reduce. We've seen steep reductions in the past, and that's expected to continue to reduce. And also green hydrogen projects can take advantage of avoided curtailment and grid charges. And as for offshore wind, as we use up our nearshore sites and move further offshore, producing energy in the form of hydrogen and piping it to shore is a lot cheaper than putting in place electrical transmission infrastructure. So it's likely that those things will all benefit large-scale hydrogen, green hydrogen production projects. On the blue hydrogen side, there's a little bit more uncertainty, and because one of the key drivers is around fossil fuel prices, and we've seen over the past week how volatile natural gas prices can be, but also around the development of carbon capture and storage, and the extent to which fugitive emissions associated with blue hydrogen can be minimized. So, but again, we're likely to see improvements in that over time in terms of the impact of cost, albeit not as steep. So eventually the cost lines for green and blue hydrogen will cross each other, as I'll explain on the next slide. And then the final area of drivers behind cost reductions is around capital availability. So as the perceived riskiness of hydrogen projects reduces, we're likely to see greater capital availability and reduce cost associated with that. But this comes back to the important enabling role of policy for early stage projects where there's a significant amount of risk. There will be an important role for policymakers and governments in order to make those projects go forward. And that could come in the form of grant funding, or revenue support, tax incentives. There's a range of different policy measures, and different governments are using different approaches in terms of that. And then the orange box just shows a couple of different views as to what might happen. As you can see from this slide, there are a lot of different variables and they're all very uncertain. And that means that there are a lot of different views around how hydrogen costs might change over time. And there are also, different interests out there pushing different perspectives. So there's a lot of different views out there in the marketplace. If we can just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is one view. So you can see that grey hydrogen costs, which are on the left, are expected to increase over time, which reflects the increased pricing associated with carbon over time. Blue hydrogen, which confusingly is in yellow on this graph, remains roughly the same. So although we're expecting to see improvements in CCS, we're not clear what the impact of natural gas prices might be. And there's also an issue potentially around the pricing associated with fugitive emissions. That compares with, on the right-hand side, green hydrogen. So you can see there's a steep cost reduction expected, which reflects levelized cost of electricity, improvements in technology and performance, and also things like availability of financing. So the cost drivers that we previously explained. the red dotted lines give a couple of ideas of how these prices might compare to the expectations of potential off-takers. Large-scale industrial off-takers might be expecting a price between about 1 and 2 euros per kilogram, whereas transport off-takers will be less price sensitive potentially. And I'll discuss that towards the end of this presentation as I get on to how the hydrogen market might develop over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so bearing all of this in mind, those kind of key drivers, the sort of barriers and enablers that we've discussed, how might we see the hydrogen economy develop over the next decade and as we look out to 2050 and the global aspirations that have been articulated by many countries with regards to reaching net zero? So it's likely that for the sort of first half of this decade, we'll see a range of small-scale demonstrator projects with a lot of learnings associated with them. A lot of laying the groundwork in terms of developing regulations, filling out the policy detail associated with hydrogen, and early mover projects which have anchor off-takers, enabling them to move forward. We're also seeing OEMs invest heavily in R&D. Then towards the end of this decade, we're likely to see the first commercial projects start to come online, generally clustered around hydrogen valleys and islands in order to achieve synergies and share infrastructure and enable them to achieve cost savings associated with that. We'll see rapid scaling of the industry, significant cost reductions associated with moving to scale, and the sort of move to serialized manufacturing that I discussed earlier, and technology improvements. It's likely that there'll be a transitional role for blue, particularly over the next couple of decades, as a market maker, and because it will take quite a long time for green hydrogen to be able to scale up to meet demand, and also for the costs associated with green hydrogen to reduce, as we saw in the previous slide. But then by 2050, we would expect that as the goal of net zero approaches, the role of green would become increasingly important. It would also have become cost competitive with fossil fuels. And we will have in place the large-scale storage and transport infrastructure that we need in order to facilitate the global hydrogen economy. If we can go into the next slide, please. So here are a couple of example sectors that could be critical to realizing this phased approach that I've discussed. So on the first slide, we have an industrial end user. So industrial clusters can create, a large-scale demand over, a significant number of years, which can then enable hydrogen production projects to go ahead. That makes them investable. They can have a long-term offtake agreement. But the downside is the relative price sensitivity, particularly while externalities such as carbon pricing isn't creating a significant impact to improve the cost competitiveness of low carbon hydrogen. Industrial clusters, it's likely that they will provide anchor demand from which the hydrogen economy can grow. On the right-hand side, you have transport. So as we mentioned, transport is likely to be less price sensitive when compared to industrial users. But there are issues around small volumes, at least in the initial years, and until we have a critical mass of infrastructure that has been implemented. So what we may see is that these two sectors to enable the sort of early stage development of the hydrogen economy will have anchor industrial clusters, and we'll have in kind of hydrogen valley type setups, and then hydrogen valleys will then grow through transport corridors in order to link together. And from that, we'll see the development of and the growth of a broader hydrogen economy. So I hope that that's been interesting. I'll pass back to you, Caroline, for the sum up.
Thank you, Molly. It was very interesting. Thanks a lot. So if I try to summarize, why is hydrogen important and why are we talking about it right now? First of all, large decarbonization potential. Of course, you know, it will depend on what kind of hydrogen you're making and what's its carbon intensity. But as we've seen, it can be used in a lot of different applications. Some of them have no other options really to get to net zero, and could be a significant part of the energy demand in 2050. Having said that, it's important that hydrogen is being seen not as the sort of the wonder molecule that's going to solve everything, but more one of the tools in the toolbox, and it's important that we follow an optimal decarbonization pathways. There will be applications in which it will be more efficient or more cost effective to use electrification, for example, and that is also important to know. And to make all of this happen, it requires a lot of things to develop in parallel, from the various technologies, which, you know, they're mature, but improvements are still possible. Policy, regulation, standards, as we've seen, the financing, and also that critically important point of matching demand and supply. So with this, I'm going to hand over to Loic, who is going to moderate the questions for us. Loic, what do you have in store for the presenters?
Thanks very much, all of you, for the presentation. Yeah, we have very different questions. We've started the presentation with some concerns about security, and the first one is about security. Someone asked if there is a need to have a full-time presence of an emergency squad on site, if a fire prevention equipment will have to be on site, or if the site could be operated 100% remotely. Magnus, do you have views on that?
Yes, we see, depending on the plant size and installations, there are, and also the local requirements, there might be emergency squads combined with cluster, for instance, that have these procedures for tackling unwanted incidents. And when it comes to hydrogen, it burns without any visible color. So you need advanced detection systems, and it's also normal to vent the system and use nitrogen to evacuate the system. So you have to have a certain strategy on that, and much of that is automatic, of course. But when you have a leakage, it can be a jet fire if it's immediate ignition, or if it is a delayed ignition, it can be an explosion or a flash fire. But these plants are designed to have no ignition or explosion, because it disperses and is vented out in a safe manner. But the local fire brigade, of course, has to be consulted in most cases, in most regions. And they have to be prepared for helping out if there's a serious incident.
Thanks, Magnus. Then I'm going to try to categorize different questions regarding like where they are on the value chain, regarding like the production project. We had a question regarding the fact that there is a very high availability of sun in Africa, and therefore very high potential for electrolysis by solar. And the question was why we don't see a lot of production projects in Africa. Yeah, I'm going maybe to start to answer this question. So first, Africa is a continent, and there is big differences according to the country we were talking about. There are many projects actually, and if we look at the past year, I've read recently that 10% of the project which were announced globally, which represented something like 150 gigawatts of electrolysis capacity, so a huge amount, were announced in the African continent. And the main countries with some big plans for the production of electrolytic hydrogen are Egypt, South Africa, Mauritania, Morocco, and Namibia also, where we've seen recently some agreements with the German government to create project to export some solar energy in the form of hydrogen or rated energy carriers such as ammonia or LHC up to Germany. Don't know if Molly, Caroline, or Magnus, you would like to say something else on Africa?
I think you've covered it, Loic.
Okay, thanks. Regarding like the midstream, there was a question regarding how much of hydrogen can be injected into the natural gas infrastructure. I can also start to answer to that. So first thing to remember, it's previously, before we had natural gas into our pipelines, we had turned gas in some places, which was composed of 50% of hydrogen. So transporting hydrogen into a gas pipeline is not something really new. But considering the current integrity and pipelines transporting natural gas, there are some issues of injecting H2. So the first one is integrity, because it can redamage your steel of your pipeline. There is an issue of mixing H2 and methane, because you're going to impact your calorific value, and so change the calorific value at your end uses. And so there is a question regarding the compatibility and adaptability with different uses of natural gas. And regarding the cost, there is a big question about the cost, because you have to replace some equipment, also due to a security question, because the hydrogen molecule is very small and leak more easily. And so especially with compressors on your natural gas infrastructure, you need at some point to replace compressors. So between 10% and 20% of injection of hydrogen into your gas pipeline, you start having this question on whether you should replace your compressor. And at this point, you might wonder, you might ask, okay, if you should inject it or build a new dedicated pipeline infrastructure. Magnus, Molly, anything to add about the injection of H2 into the gas pipelines?
Yes, I would like to add that there is many hydrogen readiness studies going on and how to retrofit natural gas pipelines into 100% hydrogen around the world.
Then regarding the downstream and sector and the demand, we had like different questions. The first one, maybe one for you, Magnus, also regarding your forecast you're working on. So on the basis of different projection of H2 rollout up to 2050, what are basically the trend or the volume, final volume of hydrogen you foresee, and what are like the main industries? I think you answered to this question where hydrogen was going to be consumed.
Yes, when we look at the forecasts and also the scenarios, there is a lot connected to the learning rates and experience curves, how fast it rolls out, not only for hydrogen technology itself, but also the competing learning rates and cost reduction curves. And of course, that is based on policies, and we see that almost every month now. There is competing updated policies, both regionally and by country, but also companies pledge. So this is going faster than many think.
Yeah, if we look at the different scenarios up to 2050, some scenarios predict that hydrogen will have like 10% to 20% of the final share of final energy demand. So some scenarios are much more optimistic, but also that give a number of the volume of H2 which is foreseen.
One important analogy is looking at the solar development and also the wind turbine and the battery cost curve development. We might expect a similar timeline, what has happened the past 10 to 15 years. So when it comes to commercialization of the new clean hydrogen technologies.
Maybe just to add one more thing on scenarios and their basis, there's two kinds of scenarios, right? There's the ones that are what needs to happen to meet 1.5, possible, but rather ambitious. And there are the scenarios that are more based on what is likely to happen based on current developments. And there's usually a gap between the two, which also explains sometimes some of the different numbers you're seeing in the final energy demand that hydrogen could meet.
Another question on the demand side. Someone was explaining that there is obviously a hype around hydrogen to build a hydrogen economy, and some views say that we should first go for direct electrification if possible, especially for passengers car and even for the thermal industry, and then think about hydrogen in second time. So what is the view of the panel of it? Does the hydrogen only have a limited potential? I think, especially for the mobility sector and the thermal industry, or should it compete with electrification?
So I have a crack at that one, and then anyone else can jump in if they disagree. It'd be good to have a controversial discussion. So my view is that because of the efficiency loss of electricity to hydrogen, if you can electrify an application rather than use hydrogen, then that makes sense. But there are complexities around that. So for countries which already have an existing gas network, so for example, in the UK and in Portugal, there's been a lot of work done to understand the whole system cost associated with full electrification compared to converting that network to use hydrogen. And converting to hydrogen is a lot cheaper. I can't remember the numbers, but it was in the tens of billions, a lot cheaper from the system's perspective to repurpose the network. So we need to think of it that way. And the other interesting aspect of it is that hydrogen can play an important role in opening up new opportunities for renewables. So it might not be possible to bring in electricity from, I mentioned the example of offshore wind in my presentation because there'd be a lot of losses or costs associated with bringing in electricity from sites very far from shore, which wouldn't make it economically viable if you were generating electricity and bringing that energy to shore in the form of electricity. But if you're bringing that energy to shore in the form of hydrogen, well, you've got a lot less losses. It costs a lot less for your transmission infrastructure. It's maybe 4 times less for a hydrogen pipeline compared to the equivalent electricity infrastructure. So that renewables resource that would otherwise go to waste or not be able to be realized in a commercial way, we can use that to generate hydrogen, put that into the economy. So absolutely, I sort of agree with the person asking the question that if it's possible to electrify applications rather than use hydrogen, that's a much more efficient way forward. But there are broader sort of whole systems perspectives in terms of how we can achieve an optimized approach to decarbonising our economies. I don't know if anyone else has a different view, though. Very happy to.
No, but I'll just add on the passenger car question specifically. There are very different views on that, right? And there are people who are saying, forget it, will never happen. Even for heavy duty trucks, batteries will win in the end because of efficiencies that are going to be realized. And some people who are betting very much on hydrogen passenger cars, some of the companies, of course, Shell, Toyota, Hyundai, are very much betting on that. So time will tell whose view will win, but some of the arguments are being used by the people who believe in hydrogen for passenger cars are the fact that, first of all, range anxiety, as we all know, the fact that the infrastructure with hydrogen looks a lot more like the infrastructure that we currently have for petrol stations, and also just the whole bottleneck of having the entire passenger car system to electricity. I mean, for those of us in Europe, you've seen what happens on holiday weekends and people queuing up at petrol stations. Imagine if they need to fill up their cars for 20-30 minutes with electricity. That might become rather of an issue, or maybe it won't be an issue anymore because we won't use cars to go on holidays. Who knows? But those are some of the arguments that are being used and are out there, and there are widely different views as to whether we'll see hydrogen for passenger cars. So take your bet.
We are at the end of the presentation, and unfortunately, we did not answer all the questions. We have questions also regarding policies and skills around R&D, but I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, Caroline, that we have all emails at the end of the presentation, and people can reach
Correct. Out. In a few days, yeah, let me put that out. So indeed, if you want to talk to the presenters and reach out, please feel free to do that. Here are the contact details over here. And we will send the slides and also the recording in the next few days so that you have that, and also for the people who may have missed the webinar today. So thank you all for joining. Huge thanks to Magnus, Molly, and Loic for teaming up on this presentation. We hope it's been useful, and we'll see you soon.